What do you mean the buyer just defaulted and lost all their earnest money? The appraisal came in low. We had an appraisal contingency. The buyer terminated before the end of that date. Why did they lose their earnest money? Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Real Estate Academy of America. Yes, that is what happened. Yes, the buyer did have an appraisal contingency, but the termination is not based on that initial time frame that you think it is. Let's rewind. Okay, Dana, what are you talking about? Well, hello, everybody. Thank you guys so much for watching. And this is a brief video to please make sure to read through the contracts, especially if you are an experienced agent here in Georgia. The Georgia Association of Realtors contracts has undergone many changes throughout the years. And the way the appraisal contingency works now is different than how it used to work years ago. So, what am I talking about? Well, in the Georgia Association of Realtors Conventional Loan Contingency Exhibit, this is GAR Form F404. The buyer has two built-in contingencies on this form. The time frame is what you negotiate with the seller, but the contingencies are the financing contingency time frame. That means the time frame the seller gives the buyer the opportunity to convince the lender to lend them the money. That's not today's video. Today's video is the appraisal contingency time frame. What is that? That means that the whole deal, the transaction between the buyer and the seller, is contingent upon the property appraising for the contract sale price. Meaning that if the lender is going to lend the buyer the money, and if the buyer ends up defaulting, the lender can take the property back, sell it, and they'll recoup the money they lent to the buyer. So it is contingent upon the property appraising for the sale price that the buyer and seller agreed to in the contract. If it does not, yes, the buyer does have the opportunity to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. However, it's not an immediate termination right based upon a low appraisal. So let's look at the contract and see what it says. Well, the first thing we have to know is what's the time frame? How long? It's not through closing on the if a buyer's getting a conventional loan. There is a specific time frame that the buyer and seller negotiate for this appraisal. That is negotiated in paragraph 4. And it doesn't say appraisal contingency time frame. Listen to what it says. It says length of time for buyer to request a reduction in the sale price based upon a low appraisal. The time period for the buyer to request a reduction in the sales price of the property if it appraises for less than the purchase price of the property as set forth in section 13 below shall be blank number of days from the binding agreement date. Then we go to paragraph 13, and that explains everything. So in paragraph 13, it states, in addition to the buyer's other rights herein, meaning within the conventional loan contingency exhibit, this agreement shall be subject to the following appraisal contingency. Still on the same page, everybody. Buyer shall cause the lender to A, select an appraiser to perform one or more appraisals of the property, and B, provide the seller with a copy of any appraisal that is less than the purchase price of the property. If the appraisal is for less than the purchase price of property, buyer shall not longer than the end of the time period set forth in section 4 above, that's the paragraph I just read, that's the X number of days from binding agreement date that buyer and seller negotiate for, generically speaking, this appraisal contingency. But if the appraisal comes in low, then the buyer, not later than that date, has the right to request that the seller reduce the sales price of the property to a price that is not less than the appraisal price submitted by appraised price by submitting an amendment to the sale price to the seller, along with a copy of the appraisal supporting the lower price. In the event the buyer does not timely submit an amendment to the sale price to the seller, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the buyer's right to do so, and the agreement is no longer subject to an appraisal contingency. Let me go on to read it, and then I'll backtrack. Then it goes on to say, seller shall not later than 3 days from the date of the amendment to the sale price is delivered, but not later than 2 days prior to closing, accept or reject the amendment to the sale price, or negotiate with the buyer a lesser reduction in the sale price than what is reflected on the amendment. If, within the time frame above, an amendment has not been signed or accepted by the buyer and seller and timely delivered to create a legally enforceable amendment, the buyer then shall have an additional 3 days to terminate this agreement without penalty. If the buyer does not terminate the agreement within the time frame, buyer's right to terminate due to the failure to agree to the amendment to the sale price shall be waived. Buyer shall close on the property for the purchase price as set forth as an agreement. Nothing herein shall require the buyer to seek a reduction in sale price. Okay, let's unpack that. The new word of coaching, unpack. Let's unpack that. So what does all that mean? So, agents, the date that gets filled in on the conventional loan GAR amendment conventional loan contingency exhibit, the date that gets filled in for the appraisal contingency for the low appraisal, that is not a termination time frame. That time frame, X number of days from binding agreement date, that is only the time frame if the property appraises for less than sale price that's on the contract. That is only the time frame for the buyer to send the seller an amendment and a copy of the low appraisal saying, okay, seller, the property didn't appraise for what we agreed upon. Will you sell it to me for this lower appraised price? That's that time frame, not termination. If you send a termination notice by that time frame, you've just defaulted the buyer, and the buyer will lose their earnest money. GAR, conventional loan contingency exhibit, you have to give the seller, if the property appraises for less than sale price, you have to give the seller the opportunity to sell it to you for the lower appraised price. So that time frame, buyer sends an amendment to the sale price to the seller. And just so you know, that amendment is the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, amendment number 713, amendment to the sale price. So buyer sends the seller an amendment, copy of the low appraisal saying, hey, seller, property appraised for less than sale price. Will you sell it to me for this lower appraised value? Then the seller has 3 days from the date the buyer sent them the amendment, say, yep, I'll do it. They sign it. You have an enforceable amendment. Everybody goes to closing at that new sale price. Or the seller says, nope, not selling it to you for that sale price. Or the seller can say, well, here I'm going to do a counter amendment. I'm going to initiate an amendment to the sale price for a different price. So that is the time frame for the seller. The seller has 3 days. The buyer has the time frame filled in paragraph 4. Blank number of days for binding agreement date to send the seller an amendment to the sale price. The seller, from the date they receive that amendment, has 3 days to accept, reject, or make another counter amendment to the sale price. The buyer then has, if the seller makes a counter amendment, the buyer has 3 days from the date they receive it. If you don't hear from the seller at all, that means the seller is not accepting the lower sale price. The buyer then has 3 days. So you've got X number of days from binding agreement date for the initial amendment. The seller now, the ball's in the seller's court. The seller now has 3 days to figure out what they want to do. Buyers, if you don't hear anything from the seller, you have to count those 3 days. Then the ball's back in your buyer's court. Buyer, you now have 3 days to either terminate the contract and get your earnest money back, or agree to buy the house regardless of the low appraisal for the contract sale price, and you will just have to bring additional cash to the closing table for the difference between what the lender will lend you based on the low appraisal and what you had agreed in your legally binding contract with the seller for the sale price. Bottom line, please, 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 conventional loan contingency exhibit in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract package. And again, that is GAR Form F404. Paragraph 4 is the time frame for the buyer to send the seller the amendment, not termination. Paragraph 13 explains all the time frames. Now, just because we are here, this is a little different if a buyer is getting an FHA insured loan or a VA insured loan. And in the Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, and it is the FHA loan contingency exhibit is GAR Form F407. And that appraisal contingency is a little bit different. It is couched in the paragraph called a mandatory clause, which is paragraph 12. In the VA loan contingency exhibit, which is Georgia Association of Realtors Form F410, VA loan contingency exhibit, it is also the amendatory clause, and it is spelled out in paragraph 12. If the buyer is getting a government insured loan, an FHA insured loan, or a VA insured loan, and the property appraises for less than sale price, the buyer does have the opportunity to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Now, the buyer may give the seller the option of selling it to them for the lower appraised price, but it is not a requirement like it is if the buyer's getting a conventional loan. And in a government insured loan, FHA loan, and a VA insured loan, the buyer has through day of closing, if the property appraises for less than sale price. On the FHA loan, it's not just the sale price. You have to spell out what that dollar amount is. So on the FHA loan, it's a little different. On the exhibit, you have to spell out the dollar amount. On VA, it's whatever, basically it's sale price. If it comes in low, the buyer has through day of closing, terminate the contract based on a low appraisal, and they will get their earnest money back. But today's video is on the conventional loan contingency exhibit. And we have seen recently several buyers losing their earnest money by defaulting on the contract by mistakenly thinking that that date, that time frame they filled in on the GAR conventional loan contingency exhibit, that paragraph in paragraph 4, X number of days from binding agreement date for the appraisal contingency, thinking that that is a termination time frame. Absolutely not. I hope this contract tip helped you out. Please comment below what other videos you'd like to see me do, or what other contract issues you'd like me to see, do videos on. Thank you all so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.